really brilliant esoteric topic that A, nobody ever talks about, B, there's no information on the internet or YouTube about, and C is very perfect analogy, the ancient analogy. Kind of pointed out decades ago about the unmoved mover and the axle. People say, well, axles move. It's like, oh, yeah. Person didn't seem to realize that like modern car and truck axles move and spin and then of course in turn the wheel, but the axles of the ancient days, via the carts and wagons, they were fixed. The horse actually drew the wagon and the axle was turned, and it was the unmoved mover. In other words, it was the axle of the universe. There's symbolism of the tree, and also too specifically the inverted tree. And it's kind of nearly perfect. One of the most perfect analogies that many thousands of you have told me were incredibly, inspirational and made things kind of blatantly obvious was my radio analogy. Well, it's not entirely perfect. It is extremely perfect, and you could go through hundreds of videos to try to understand the discernment between mind and consciousness, how one is pre-empirical and the other one is consubstantial and has a beginning in time and end in time, and it makes it blatantly obvious with the radio analogy. What the ancients actually had was an inverted tree symbolism, which I don't want to make things super complicated, discuss the inverted tree symbolism, but specifically the tree of life and death, but also to hit upon briefly, to whatever extent, the inverted tree. And of course, we know the inverted tree in the book of Genesis of the Old Testament, but it's something that's actually found in the Kalevala. It's found, of course, in the Old Testament. It's found in the Vedas. It's found in the Upanishads. It's found in the Nikayas. It's found in the Zohar. It's kind of found all over the place, including ancient times, and certainly precedes the Bible. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about the two trees in the Garden of Eden, which is actually the navel of the universe. I don't know to what extent, and I'm not interested how literally people take the Garden of Eden or the Tree of Life and Death in the book of Genesis, and I'm not interested in discussing that, but making things kind of more blatant and discussing an esoteric topic and the perfect analogy, nearly perfect analogy, that the ancients had of the Tree of Life and Death. Of course, the tree feeds off the supercosmic light in the metaphysical analogy of the tree, and of course the ancient people, including people of today, especially if you have a farm. I love trees, by the way. You sit underneath the tree and you have shade and warmth, and depending on the type of tree it is, we get lumber and we get fruit and we get shade. We get all sorts of things from trees. But the trees feed off of the light, and this is what the ancients actually did know. If you think that they didn't know these things, this is not the case. They feed off of the air, they feed off of the light, and of course they feed off of the earth. We of course feed off of the earth and off of the air and the pneumatic principle, and we require light also. Of course we don't need light for photosynthesis, since human beings don't do that, but they feed off of the earthly waters of the unseen roots. In the case of the axle, there's this triple world, or Triratna, which is ancient symbolism. It's found also too in the Bible, believe it or not, and in the Vedas and the Upanishads, where you actually have the axle of the universe, the unmoved pin, and this of course is analogous to the trunk of the tree, but we actually have two wheels. In the case of the tree, we actually have two orbs and two universes, the universe of the earthly and the terrestrial, and we have this super eternal, which is up in the heavens. Usually most trees, the leaves and that which collects the light, is up in the heavens. So it's kind of a perfect analogy. And the inverted tree is in the case of the human beings, where we actually have our mind in the earth, and it needs to be uprooted. But I'd like to get to that. I'm going to read a couple passages. This is from the Katha Upanishad 2.3.1. This is that Brahman, the eternal Asvata tree. Asvata tree is the Bodhi tree. I don't know if you know much about the ficus Bodhi tree or the Asvata tree, but it will actually branch out and the roots will start to descend from the heavens. Conventional trees, we have roots that are underground and unseen, but in these ficus trees, they'll actually reach out from the heavens as the and they actually propagate themselves not only vertically, but only vertically to a certain point, but they actually start to spread outwards. The limbs will spread out and the roots will descend, they'll take root again, and then you have an extension of that same tree and it'll just keep continuing itself, and so it's propagating itself outwards, not only through its fruit, or in the case of its seeds, but also to the tree itself. Every ancient culture had their own version of the holy tree. The German holy tree was the birch tree. I forget the exact tree from Finland that was the holy tree. There's a Norwegian holy tree, and I'm sorry I cannot remember the type of tree that is, but there is even a Norwegian ancient Viking tree that was their holy tree. Anyway, these trees, just like ourselves, feed off of the earth to build the body, and of course the earthly water from the unseen roots, and require the sunshine from above. The, of course, tree bears fruits, just as human beings bear fruit with the opposite gender. So it bears fruit, but what partakes of life also too partakes of death. And this is where the tree and the inverted tree symbolism comes in. The trunk, of course, is the world axle, or the axis mundi. It's no different than the center of the clock, which, of course, doesn't partake of time and is that thing that is beyond and above time. Just as a tree, of course, can be chopped down, but we consider it to be the unmoving. It is also, too, considered the chit, or the world spine. In ancient Egyptian, that word is actually chit, which is almost identical. 5 most important words in ancient Egyptian, by the way, are also the 5 most important words in ancient Pali. Anyway, this Asvata tree from Katha Upanishad 2.3.1, with its roots above and its branches below. This root is indeed called bright, actually light, but as meant not literal light, but supernal light. This is Brahman, i.e. the absolute. This alone is the immortal. In all the worlds are contained, none can pass beyond. This verily is that, with a capital T, i.e. Tat, which is synonymous with the unmoved absolute. And I'd like to get into Genesis 3 here in just in a second and discuss that and the idea of there being 2 trees. But the 2 trees are actually 1 tree. So the trunk is the world axle, and there's a sphere up in heaven. This would be the sphere of the tree that, with its leaves, that partakes of the light and reaches heavenwards and is fed not only from above but also too from below. And so we get into the idea of these 2 worlds, the earthly world and the roots, and then of course we can get into understanding the analogy of the inverted tree, where we actually have a different light which is fed from the unseen roots above. So we have this tree that's inverted with roots above, and there actually are certain trees that do have roots above, and in the case of the Asvata tree, the specific Ficus religiosa. You notice the last word of the Latin name, Ficus religiosa, is a religious tree. It's actually a reference to Indian and some other ancient cultures that partook of the nearly perfect analogy of this ficus tree, whose roots descended actually from the limbs and re-earthed themselves. And there's basically not many trees that certainly do that. So it served as a perfect analogy from the ancient world, not only the Upanishads, the Vedas, certainly so of original Buddhism. Feeding the fruits of life and death, just as man has, quote, 1 essence and 2 natures. And man, human beings, I say man, I mean human beings, has 1 essence and 2 natures. So there is always 2 selves. Every form of metaphysics, both Indian and Egyptian and Greek, speaks of the 2 selves, 1 existential, persona non grata. Bob Suleri, that is a natura naturans, a natural order of this worldly, consubstantial nature of matter and spirit, and then we have this nature that has a beginning in time and an end in time. We have a transcendental nature, which of course partakes of the light from above. So we, just like the tree, are fed from 2 different sources. And even the ancients knew that if the tree was not fed from both sources, then the tree would die. You could have all the light but none of the water, or all the water and none of the light, and the tree is going to wither and die. So we have this balance that must be fed. We have to partake, and this is one of the reasons why modern society is so corrupt and so upside down and backwards, and people are so miserable, is they're constantly feeding, this material self. It's kind of like what happens, I don't know if you did a lot of gardening, people would overwater the darn thing and not give it enough light. All I need to do is give it water. Or feed it, you'll stick Miracle Grow in there. Like, well, I fed it Miracle Grow and I keep watering. It's like, it's got root rot. It doesn't get enough light. The thing is dead not because it's starved to death, because you fed it too much Miracle Grow, probably too much, and too much water, but it didn't have enough light. Or, it's like, well, I don't know what happened to it. It's always been in the window. It gets plenty of light. So, yeah, but you forgot to water it. So it's really a quite ingenious analogy from the ancient ages. And nobody talks about this. This is why I wanted to make a video on this. I love making videos about things that nobody talks about. The inverted tree and the world axle. And this is found through every ancient metaphysics and culture. And the idea, by the way, that there are two trees in the Garden of Eden is a misunderstanding. It's actually a huge misunderstanding. So, one essence and two natures. The one essence, of course, of the tree would be its trunk, and it partakes of two things that feed it and give it life. And the same is true of human beings. So we cannot be fed by materialism and food and clothing and shelter alone. We have to be fed from a supernal light. And of course, the blood is synonymous in the tree and the inverted tree of the sap that actually runs through the tree. And if you drain it of its sap, it's of course going to die. Genesis 3, there's two trees which are in fact one tree. In the Old Testament, there's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And having partaken of same, of course, one is expelled from Eden. And the other one is the tree of life. The tree is one, samanam vriksham. Of the eagles, there is one. That is, this is not from the Genesis of the Old Testament. There is one eagle in the tree that is all-seeing, and is the eagle who partakes of the tree of life and is not cast out. And there is another eagle that eats of the fruit. Pipamam ati. These are the verse 22, Rig Veda 1.164.20. Upon the top they say the fig is sweet, and none getteth it who knoweth not the Father. There's another fruit up above and the tree that the eagle partakes of that's closest to heaven. What is explicit, of course, is the connection of the right of climbing, which is synonymous with wisdom, and the culmination thereof, which of course is self-proximity. And self-proximity, meaning itself with a capital S, meaning a disobjectification with that psychophysical self, which is in the darkness. Anything that actually partakes of the low-hanging fruit, and everybody's heard of the low-hanging fruit. There's the good fruit and there's the bad fruit. And there's a misunderstanding of everybody about Genesis 3 of the Old Testament, that they think that there's a tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then there's a tree of life. Yeah, and you're not supposed to eat of the one, you get cast out of Eden. There's actually only one tree. They're actually partaking of the wrong part of the tree. And this is what Christian and Jesuit theologians are certainly misunderstanding. There's not two trees in the Garden of Eden. So you have, the knowledge between life of death, and you partake thereof. And terms expressed in eating the fruit of the lower branches. Taking the low-hanging fruit. This is a passage, a phrase that still exists today. He took the low-hanging fruit. In other words, he took the easy path. And the path of the knowledge of good and evil, i.e. of worldly knowledge, i.e. episteme, is the low-hanging fruit. There's another fruit that's way up high that's not seen. The low-hanging fruit, to partake of the low-hanging fruit, you actually have to sit in occlusion of the sun, because you're at the base of the tree taking the low-hanging fruit, and you're occluded from the light of the Father, you could say, or the light of the One, and so you must necessitatively suffer. One fruit feeds the worldly being, the lower self. That is, of course, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Knowledge, i.e. episteme, i.e. empirical knowledge. This is what is called worldly wisdom, but was not wisdom at all. It's actually empirical knowledge. And there's another fruit that is, of course, up high. I try to make things simple on this. I could actually talk about this for like a day non-stop, but I'm trying to actually compress it down a bit. So they're not two trees. It's the one fruit of the low-hanging fruit where the light is blocked off, and then there's another fruit. In the case of the Rig Veda passage, the same as it is in the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they're both the exact same tree, but one partakes of a different fruit. One that feeds the existential self, one that actually feeds the higher self and brings one closer to thy Father. Or in the Sanskrit, it would be aham brahmasmi or tattvamasi, he who partakes of that higher fruit which is in the light and of course is closest to heaven. That's the tree that's a comprehensor, the one who reaches the top of the tree. The crown of the tree, of course, is the burning bush. The idea in the passage also, too, of Moses and the burning bush, actually it's sitting at the base of the tree where human beings exist on earth, terra firma, and looking up, and the top of a tree with the sun shining through it. It looks like a burning bush, and this is actually where the burning bush comes from. The burning bush is taken way too literally. It has to be understood in the lens of metaphysical analogy and what is actually being said. The solar feeder of the tree and the fire through the limbs, i.e. the rays extending down. Breaking the ridgepole of the wise person, this is the axle between heaven and earth. There's an ancient passage, not only in the Vedas, but also too in the Nikayas, of the supernal wise master who breaks the ridgepole. This is breaking the tree, and he who breaks the tree burns it, and the one who burns with wisdom, and this is where the interesting thing comes in that nobody's talked about, including Kumaraswamy or any of these other commentators on metaphysics and the heavenly tree, or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life. And this word that people use, samadhi, I think most of you know what samadhi is. Samadhi comes from the word janma. Janma means to burn, from the word, the noun jayate, to burn. Wisdom is burning. It's burning away objectivity. He who breaks the tree, cuts it up, and throws it on the fire, burns away objectivity, so that there's no longer a connection between these two worlds, this axle which ties the heavenly with the worldly, of terra firma, i.e. of human beings. You've actually chopped the tree down and you've burned it. You have no longer need of anything. When you cross the other shore, gate, perasam gate, as the Sanskrit goes, you no longer have need of the canoe. I mean, the canoe becomes worthless. You build the canoe becomes all important, but once you've crossed it, you have no longer any need of it, i.e. the idea of crossing the other shore, which of course is the ideation of transcendence and supreme enlightenment. The canoe serves no longer any purpose. It's nothing other than a vehicle for getting to the other side. So this is wherein the wise master burns the tree. The mind, of course, burns the axle wood of the tree of life and of death, i.e. the tree of knowledge, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life. The fool, of course, feeds not upon the light, but the fruit of the tree and the low-hanging fruit, and burns the fallen limbs to keep himself alive. And he will chop down that tree, but only once he's actually planted more trees, and so he's actually setting himself up for eternal becoming. It's like, well, he could chop down that tree, but he needs to plant more. And this is what, of course, a farmer does, or a tree farmer, where they they'll plant tons and tons of trees. They will feed off that part of the trees and their fruit and the wood thereof, but they've already planted hundreds more trees, and so it's this perpetual unending cycle, which of course is where we get samsara. So just now as the Atman, the Brahman, and the Yaksha. Yaksha, by the way, is a nature spirit. In the tree of life, wherein is manifested the aspect of the supercosmic person, so also is every man, the Atmanam Yaksha. That's AV 843. And as it were, a tree. That's Job 18:16, by the way, if you want a Bible verse. As is a tree, just as is the Lord of trees, so indeed is man. That's Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 3.9.8. This is the tree of the world vortex, or samsara vriksha. Vriksha is Sanskrit for vortex. Samsara vriksha, the tree of the world vortex. Samsara vriksha. Compact of all desires and activities in its downward branches, and of the world which the creatures have their several beings. It's rooted in the pure light of spirit, i.e. Brahman, the immortal and immutable, as a tree resounding with the cries of all those, whether gods or men, or animals or ghosts, who nest in its branches. It is a growth without beginning or an end in time, but of an ever-changing aspect. The tree has all to do with actions, whether ordinate or inordinate, i.e. karma, dharma, dharma lakshana, i.e. prakriti, which is just a fancy ancient word for a natural order, prakriti. The fruits of the tree in this respect is like the Vedas, where another manifestation of it is Brahman, but I don't need to go into that boring aspect. But the ancient radio analogy that I've used to explain mind, brain, and consciousness, and spirit and consubstantiality, the union of two things and the third thing, you can't take the analogy too far. Every ancient culture had their own holy tree. The Ficus religiosa of ancient India, i.e. the Bodhi tree or the Bodhi ficus tree, it goes by several different names. Ficus religiosa is the Latin name. Norway had their own, the Vikings had their own. Norway didn't exist back then, obviously, so. Finland had their own, the Germans had the birch tree. Ancient cultures in Southeast Asia had their own. One was the coconut tree, I forget of which particular culture. But it is the world axle. If you think of an axle and the two wheels associated with it, in relevance not to, of course, a modern vehicle where the axle turns, but the ancient axle of a chariot or a wagon, you have the fixed axle, i.e. the tree, and the two universes of the supernal and the eternal and the worldly tree. We actually have two balls or two universes of existence. One of the worldly, which feeds off of the waters, which falls from the heavens, which of course people have been praying for rain for countless thousands of years. Many of them still do. And you have the other end of the tree, which feeds off of the light and does take in air. And the ancients actually knew this. Of course they knew this. They watched nature really closely. Just because they weren't technologically advanced didn't mean they were stupid. They definitely knew a lot about nature. So he actually had these two ends of the tree, these two worlds, these two universes, which were supportive of this axle, which had within it the lifeblood of the tree sap, and human beings were like this. And if I could go into it a lot more deeper, I would actually get into the inverted tree symbolism, but human beings are exactly like that inverted tree. Our mind actually takes of the light of the absolute, but our body takes in the waters for our growth and life and sustainment, but both are necessary. And this, of course, is why human beings are in balance, as we take stuff in, but we actually completely blocked out the light. It's kind of like that plant that you've been feeding Miracle Grow and water to, and it's still withering. It's like, hey, what's wrong with it? It's like, yeah, it hasn't seen the light of day in a long time. Human beings are intellectually withered, so this tree symbolism, the ancient tree symbolism, and the tree of life, knowledge of life and death, and the tree of, knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life are one and the same tree. So this is the whole symbol of the ancient tree. I hope you like this video. I like to go a lot more into depth, but then I just might end up boring people to death and they might start nodding off. If you ever want to contact me, my information is in the description below. Any donations always warmly welcome. Have a lovely week. Lux Everetas.